The carriage wheels screamed against the wet stone as Alexander Whitmore gripped the door handle, his knuckles pale in the darkness. Behind him, the estate he had once called home was now a burned shell of memory, and ahead of him waited a woman he intended to destroy through marriage. He did not know her face yet. He only knew her name, and that name was enough to fuel the fire inside his chest. 3 weeks earlier, he had stood over his father's grave in the pouring rain, listening to whispers from men who claimed to be friends of the family. They spoke in hushed tones about debts that had appeared out of nowhere, about signatures that looked forged, about a business deal gone wrong that had stripped the Whitmore name of everything it once meant. And at the center of every whisper was one family, the Ashfords. Gerald Ashford had been his father's trusted partner for over a decade. They built shipping routes together, opened trade houses together, and stood beside each other through every storm that threatened their fortunes. But in the final year of his life, Alexander's father had signed away control of 3 major properties to Gerald Ashford under circumstances nobody could fully explain. When he died, the family discovered the truth. The signatures were real, but they had been obtained through lies, false promises, and documents that hid their true purpose beneath layers of legal language, designed to confuse rather than clarify. Alexander had spent the following weeks going through his father's letters, his ledgers, and his private correspondence. What he found chilled him. His father had trusted Gerald Ashford completely, right up until the moment he realized the depth of the betrayal. By then it was too late. The stress of the discovery, combined with the illness that had already been weakening him, took his life within months. Now Alexander stood as the new Duke of Whitmore, inheriting a title with almost nothing behind it. The family estate was mortgaged beyond reason. The staff had been reduced to a skeleton crew, and every attempt he made to reclaim what belonged to his family through legal means had been blocked, delayed, or dismissed by judges who seemed strangely sympathetic to the Ashford name. He could have walked away. Many in his position would have quietly accepted the loss, sold what remained, and started fresh somewhere far from the gossip and pity that followed a fallen house. But Alexander was not built that way. He had inherited his father's stubbornness along with his title, and stubbornness, combined with fury, had led him to a plan so bold that even his closest friend called it madness. Gerald Ashford had a daughter. Her name was Heiress, and she was, according to every source Alexander could find, the last remaining piece the man valued above all else. Gerald had no sons, no other children, and his wife had passed years earlier. Heiress was set to inherit everything once her father grew too old to manage his affairs, or once he passed entirely. She was, in every practical sense, the future of the Ashford family. Alexander's plan was simple in its cruelty. He would marry Heiress Ashford. He would use the marriage to gain access to the family's inner workings, to their financial records, to the very documents that could prove what Gerald had done to his father. And once he had what he needed, he would expose the truth publicly, ruin the Ashford name completely, and perhaps, if fate allowed it, take back everything that rightfully belonged to the Whitmores. He told himself this was justice. He told himself that a woman raised inside a house built on deception could not possibly be innocent of its foundations. He told himself many things during that carriage ride, trying to steady the small, uncomfortable voice in the back of his mind that whispered this plan, required him to hurt someone who might have done nothing wrong at all. The carriage rolled to a stop outside a modest townhouse on the edge of the city, far smaller and plainer than Alexander had expected for a family as wealthy as the Ashfords. He stepped out into the cool evening air and studied the building. No grand columns, no sweeping gardens, nothing that spoke of the fortune he knew existed somewhere behind these walls. It was strange, and strangeness made him cautious. He had arranged this meeting through a mutual acquaintance, a merchant named Charles Bennett who owed Alexander a favor from years past. Bennett had told Gerald Ashford that the young Duke of Whitmore wished to discuss a possible reconciliation between their families, a chance to heal old wounds and perhaps even strengthen both houses through new connections. Gerald, ever the opportunist, had agreed to the meeting without hesitation. Alexander suspected the man saw an advantage in aligning himself more closely with a title, even a title stripped of most of its wealth. What Alexander had not expected was to be greeted at the door not by Gerald Ashford, but by a young woman with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, wearing a plain gray dress with no jewelry, no elaborate hairstyle, nothing that suggested she belonged to one of the wealthiest families in the region. "You must be the Duke," she said, her voice calm and steady. "My father is finishing some correspondence. He asked me to receive you until he is ready." Alexander studied her for a long moment, trying to reconcile this quiet, unassuming woman with the image he had built in his mind of a spoiled heiress living comfortably off her father's stolen fortune. "And you are?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Eleanor," she said simply, stepping aside to let him enter. "Please come in." The inside of the house matched its exterior. Simple furniture, worn but well cared for. Books stacked neatly on shelves that had clearly been read many times over, their spines cracked and softened with use. A small fire burned in the hearth, providing warmth without extravagance. Nothing about this room suggested wealth beyond what was necessary for comfort. "Your home is smaller than I expected," Alexander said, watching her reaction carefully. Eleanor's expression did not change. "My father believes wealth should be kept where it can grow, not displayed where it can be admired. We live simply so that our resources can be used elsewhere." Alexander wanted to ask what exactly those resources were being used for, given what he knew about the money stolen from his own family, but he held his tongue. There would be time for those questions later, once he had secured his position within the family through marriage. They sat together in the small parlor, and for nearly 20 minutes, Eleanor made polite conversation about the weather, about recent events in the city, about books she had recently read. Alexander found himself unable to detect any trace of the cunning or greed he had expected from someone raised inside the Ashford household. She spoke thoughtfully, listened carefully, and seemed genuinely interested in his responses rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. When Gerald Ashford finally entered the room, he was exactly what Alexander expected. A tall man with a broad smile that never quite reached his eyes, dressed in fine clothing that stood in sharp contrast to the modest furnishings around him. He greeted Alexander with exaggerated warmth, clasping his hand firmly and expressing how pleased he was that the two families might finally move past old misunderstandings. "Misunderstandings," Alexander repeated carefully, keeping his voice even despite the anger building inside him. "That is one way to describe it." Gerald's smile faltered only slightly. "Your father and I had our disagreements toward the end, yes. Business is complicated, my boy. Sometimes decisions look different in hindsight than they did at the time they were made." Alexander wanted nothing more than to demand answers immediately, to confront the man about the forged signatures and the stolen properties and the years of trust that had been so thoroughly betrayed. But he had not come here for confrontation. He had come here for access, and access required patience. "I did not come to relitigate the past," Alexander said instead. "I came because I believe our families might benefit from a stronger connection moving forward, a connection that could benefit us both." Gerald's eyes lit up with interest, and beside him, Eleanor's expression grew slightly more guarded, as though she sensed the direction this conversation was about to take before her father did. "What kind of connection did you have in mind?" Gerald asked, though the eagerness in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer. Alexander turned his gaze toward Eleanor, watching her carefully as he spoke the words that would set his plan into motion. "I would like to propose marriage between myself and your daughter." The room fell silent. Gerald's face broke into an expression of pure delight, clearly calculating the benefits such a union would bring to his family's reputation and influence. But Eleanor's reaction was different. She did not smile. She did not look pleased or flattered. Instead, she studied Alexander with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see straight through the careful mask he had constructed for this meeting. "You barely know me," she said quietly. "Why would you propose such a thing after a single conversation?" It was a fair question, and Alexander had prepared an answer for it. Marriages between families of our standing are rarely built on romance alone. I believe a practical union, based on mutual respect and shared interest in healing the rift between our houses, could serve us both well. Elinor continued to study him, and for a brief moment, Alexander worried that she saw too much, that her quiet intelligence had already begun to unravel the threads of his careful deception. But then Gerald spoke, cutting through the tension with his booming, enthusiastic voice. "This is wonderful news, truly wonderful. Elinor, my dear, this could be exactly what our family needs." Elinor's gaze shifted briefly to her father, and Alexander noticed something flicker across her face, something that looked almost like resignation, as though she had learned long ago that her opinions carried little weight in decisions that affected her own future. It was a small detail, but it stayed with him. "I will need time to consider this," Elinor said finally, her voice steady despite whatever emotions might have been churning beneath the surface. "Of course," Alexander replied, though internally he felt a flicker of frustration at the delay. He needed this marriage to happen quickly, before Gerald had time to investigate his true motives too deeply. Gerald, however, seemed unwilling to let the opportunity slip away. "Nonsense. This is a wonderful match, Elinor. The Duke is offering you a title, a connection to one of the most respected families in the region. What is there to consider?" Elinor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing more to contradict her father in front of their guest. Alexander watched this exchange with growing curiosity. There was clearly tension between father and daughter, a dynamic that did not match the picture of a spoiled heiress living happily under her father's protection. Before he left that evening, Alexander requested a private moment with Elinor, using the excuse of discussing wedding logistics. Gerald, eager to seal the arrangement, granted the request without hesitation and left the room to attend to other business. Once they were alone, Elinor turned to Alexander with an expression that was neither hostile nor warm, but carefully neutral. "I do not know what you truly want from this marriage," she said quietly, "but I do not believe it is what you claim." Alexander felt a jolt of alarm at her directness. "What makes you say that?" "Because men do not propose marriage to strangers after learning their family names are connected to old grievances unless they want something specific," she replied. "I am not foolish, Duke Whitmore. I have lived my entire life watching my father use people to get what he wants. I recognize the pattern when I see it." For a moment, Alexander considered abandoning his careful mask entirely, telling her the truth simply because her perceptiveness demanded honesty. But he pushed the impulse aside, reminding himself of his purpose, of the injustice done to his father, of the ruin that had befallen his family because of the very household this woman had grown up inside. "Perhaps I simply want to build something better than what our fathers left behind," he said instead, choosing his words carefully. Elinor studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened slightly, though whether from genuine consideration or simple exhaustion with the situation, Alexander could not tell. "I will agree to this marriage," she said finally. "Not because I believe your explanation, but because refusing would only bring consequences I am not prepared to face." Her words struck him as strange, hinting at fears and pressures he did not yet understand. But he did not press for details. He had what he needed. The marriage would proceed, and once it did, he would have access to everything required to expose Gerald Ashford's crimes and reclaim his family's honor. As he climbed back into his carriage that night, Alexander should have felt triumphant. His plan was moving forward exactly as intended. Instead, he found himself replaying the conversation with Elinor over and over, unable to shake the image of her careful, guarded expression, or the strange resignation in her voice when she agreed to marry a man she clearly did not trust. He told himself it did not matter. She was an Ashford, and Ashfords had taken everything from his family. Whatever discomfort he felt about deceiving her was simply the cost of justice, a small price to pay for restoring what had been stolen. But somewhere in the back of his mind, A quiet voice continued to whisper that this story was not as simple as he believed it to be, and that the woman he had just agreed to marry might be far more than the tool he intended to use. Elinor stood alone in her room 3 nights before her wedding, staring at a small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard, and her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded piece of paper so old the creases had turned soft as cloth, and a single silver locket that did not match anything else she owned. She had found this box when she was 12 years old, hidden in a trunk that had once belonged to her mother, and she had never shown it to anyone, not even her father. The paper contained a name that was not her own, Elinor Hartley, not Elinor Ashford, and beneath the name a date and a location that meant nothing to her, though she had spent years quietly trying to understand its significance. Whenever she asked her father about her mother's family, about where she had come from before joining the Ashford household, Gerald would grow cold and change the subject, insisting that such questions served no purpose and that her only family was the one she had now. But children who grow up sensing that something has been hidden from them rarely stop wondering, and Elinor had spent years piecing together small clues. Servants who let slip comments they quickly tried to retract. Old letters glimpsed before being locked away again. A portrait in a hallway that had been removed without explanation when she was 9 years old, leaving only a faded rectangle on the wallpaper where it once hung. She closed the box and returned it to its hiding place, then sat on the edge of her bed, thinking about the marriage that awaited her. She did not trust Alexander Whitmore, not fully, but something about him intrigued her despite her caution. He carried himself like a man burdened by something heavy, something he was determined to carry alone. She recognized that particular weight because she carried a similar one herself. Her father found her in the hallway the following morning, his expression unusually serious. "You understand what this marriage means for our family," he said, not quite a question. "I understand what you have told me it means," Elinor replied carefully. Gerald's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do not be difficult, Elinor. This connection to the Whitmore title opens doors that have been closed to us for years. I need you to conduct yourself properly during this marriage. No questions, no unnecessary curiosity about matters that do not concern you." "What matters would those be?" Elinor asked, unable to resist the small provocation. "Family business," Gerald said sharply, "nothing more." Elinor said nothing further, though the exchange only deepened her suspicion that her father's business dealings, and perhaps her own upcoming marriage, were connected to something he desperately wanted to keep hidden. She had long suspected that her father's fortune had not been built entirely through honest means, and the tension she sensed whenever the Whitmore family was mentioned only confirmed her fears. The wedding took place on a gray afternoon in early autumn, in a small chapel attended by a modest gathering of guests. Alexander stood at the altar in formal attire, his expression composed and unreadable, while Elinor walked toward him in a simple ivory gown that had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep despite her father's insistence on newer, more fashionable clothing. Their vows were spoken with quiet formality, neither of them offering more warmth than the occasion strictly required. When Alexander placed the ring on her finger, his hands were steady, but Elinor noticed a brief flicker of something in his eyes, something that looked almost like guilt, though it vanished so quickly she wondered if she had imagined it. Following the ceremony, Elinor moved into the Whitmore estate, a grand but weathered building that bore the marks of financial struggle despite its impressive architecture. The staff greeted her with polite curiosity, having clearly heard rumors about the sudden marriage and its unusual circumstances. Among them was Edmund, the estate's aging butler, who had served the Whitmore family for over 30 years and regarded Elinor with a careful, watchful gaze that suggested he was reserving judgment until he understood her intentions. Alexander's mother, Constance Whitmore, received Elinor with a warmth that surprised her. The older woman had suffered greatly since her husband's death, her health weakened by grief and stress, but she still possessed a sharp mind and a gentle spirit that immediately put Elinor at ease. "I know this marriage was arranged quickly," Constance said during their first private conversation, settled in the small sitting room she rarely left due to her fragile health. "I do not fully understand my son's reasons, but I hope you will find some measure of happiness here, regardless of how this began." "Thank you," Elena replied, genuinely touched by the kindness. "I hope to earn everyone's trust in time." Constance studied her for a long moment. "You already have more of it than you realize. My son does not bring people into this house lightly, whatever his reasons for this marriage might be." Elena wondered privately whether Constance knew more about Alexander's true motivations than she let on, but she did not press the question. Instead, she focused on settling into her new life, learning the rhythms of the household, and slowly building relationships with the staff who had initially regarded her with suspicion. Within the first 2 weeks, Elena discovered that the estate's finances were in far worse condition than she had realized. Ledgers showed mounting debts, properties mortgaged to their limits, and staff wages that had been delayed more than once due to insufficient funds. She said nothing to Alexander about her discoveries at first, uncertain whether raising the subject would be seen as overstepping her role, but the problem weighed on her mind constantly. One evening she found Alexander alone in the study, surrounded by stacks of papers and account books, his expression tense with frustration. She hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to intrude, but something in his posture, the exhaustion evident in the set of his shoulders, moved her to step inside. "May I help?" she asked quietly. Alexander looked up, clearly startled by her presence. "This is not something that concerns you." "I live in this house now," Elena replied evenly. "Its troubles concern me, whether you wish them to or not." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted slightly, a grudging acknowledgement of the truth in her words. "The estate has significant debts," he admitted finally. "Debts that predate my father's death, complicated by circumstances I am still working to understand fully." Elena sat down across from him, examining the ledgers spread across the desk. To Alexander's visible surprise, she began identifying patterns within the numbers almost immediately, pointing out inefficiencies in how certain accounts had been managed, suggesting adjustments that could ease some of the immediate financial pressure. "Where did you learn to read financial records so well?" Alexander asked, unable to hide his astonishment. "My father insisted I understand business matters from a young age," Elena replied. Though she did not elaborate on the complicated relationship this education had created between herself and Gerald, who had used her skills to assist with his own dealings while simultaneously excluding her from any real decision-making power. Over the following days, Elena became increasingly involved in helping manage the estate's finances, working alongside Alexander in the study each evening. Their conversations, initially strictly practical, gradually began to reveal small details about each other's lives, their fears, their hopes for the future. Alexander found himself surprised by how easily he could talk to her, how her quiet intelligence and calm demeanor made even the most stressful discussions feel manageable. He reminded himself often that this closeness was dangerous, that he could not allow himself to grow attached to a woman he intended to use as a means to an end. But each evening, as they worked side by side, the reminder grew harder to hold on to. Elena, for her part, found herself equally conflicted. She had entered this marriage prepared for coldness, for a distant and purely transactional relationship, but Alexander's genuine gratitude for her help, his willingness to listen to her ideas, and the flashes of vulnerability he occasionally allowed her to see, chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. Still, she remained cautious. She had not forgotten his strange proposal, the swiftness with which he had pursued this marriage after learning of the tension between their families. Something did not add up, and Elena's instincts, honed by years of navigating her father's manipulative household, told her that Alexander Whitmore was hiding something significant. One afternoon, while searching through old family records to help organize the estate's archives, Elena came across a stack of letters written by the late Duke Edward Whitmore, Alexander's father. Curiosity got the better of her, and she began reading, initially intending only to glance through them briefly before returning to her assigned task. The letters revealed a story of betrayal and financial ruin connected directly to her own family. As she read further, her hands began to shake, understanding gradually dawning as she pieced together the truth. Gerald Ashford had deceived Edward Whitmore, manipulating him into signing away valuable properties through documents disguised as routine business agreements. The betrayal had devastated the Whitmore family, contributing directly to Edward's declining health and eventual death. Eleanor sat frozen, the letters trembling in her hands, as pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. This was why Alexander had proposed marriage so suddenly. This was the true purpose behind his sudden interest in reconciling their families. He had not married her out of genuine affection or a desire for peace between their houses. He had married her because she was a tool, a means of gaining access to information that could expose her father's crimes. The realization struck her with unexpected force, a mixture of anger at being deceived and a strange, unwelcome hurt that surprised her with its intensity. Despite everything, despite her initial distrust, she had begun to hope that perhaps this marriage held the possibility of something genuine. She heard footsteps approaching the study and quickly gathered the letters, unsure whether to confront Alexander immediately or wait until she had processed her own feelings about the discovery. The door opened, and Alexander entered, his expression brightening slightly upon seeing her, unaware that the woman before him now held proof of his true intentions. "I did not expect to find you here so late," he said, setting down a small stack of papers he had been carrying. Eleanor forced her expression into careful neutrality, tucking the letters beneath the larger stack of documents she had been organizing. "I lost track of time while working," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Alexander studied her for a moment, something flickering behind his eyes as though he sensed a shift in her demeanor, but he did not press further. Instead, he moved to sit across from her, continuing their evening routine of reviewing financial matters as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed for Eleanor. As they worked together that evening, she found herself watching him differently, searching his expressions for signs of the deception she now knew existed beneath his carefully composed exterior. She said nothing about her discovery, uncertain what to do with the knowledge, uncertain whether confronting him immediately would help or harm whatever fragile trust had begun to grow between them. Later that night, alone in her room, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, turning the situation over in her mind again and again. She could confront Alexander directly, demand answers, and likely bring their fragile marriage crashing down before it had truly begun. Or she could remain silent, continue observing, and try to understand the full scope of what he intended to do with the information he sought. She thought of her father, of his cold dismissal whenever she asked questions about matters he wished to keep hidden, of the strange documents and hidden portraits from her childhood that suggested her own history contained secrets far deeper than she currently understood. Perhaps, she reasoned, Alexander's search for truth about her father's dealings might inadvertently lead her closer to answers about her own past, answers she had been seeking for years without success. With this thought settling uneasily in her mind, Eleanor made a decision. She would not confront Alexander yet. Instead, she would watch, wait, and gather her own understanding of the truth. Even as she navigated the growing complexity of feelings she had not expected to develop for the man who had married her under false pretenses. Sleep did not come easily that night, and as she finally drifted into uneasy dreams, she could not shake the feeling that the path ahead held far more danger and revelation than either she or Alexander currently understood. A carriage arrived at the Whitmore estate without warning on a cold morning nearly a month into the marriage, and the moment Eleanor saw who stepped out of it, her stomach tightened with dread. Gerald Ashford strode toward the entrance with his usual confident swagger, but there was something different in his expression, something calculating that made Eleanor's instincts scream warning. She met him in the entrance hall before he could venture further into the house. "Father, I was not expecting you." "Can a father not visit his daughter?" Gerald asked, though his tone carried none of the warmth the words implied. I wish to see how married life suits you. Alina led him into a small sitting room, choosing the space carefully to keep their conversation away from the rest of the household. Once seated, Gerald's pleasant mask slipped away entirely, revealing the sharp, calculating man Alina knew far better than the version he presented to society. I have heard concerning things, he said, his voice low. Rumors that your husband has been reviewing old family documents concerning our business dealings with his late father. Alina kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart raced at how quickly her father's network of informants had discovered Alexander's activities. I know nothing of such matters, she lied smoothly, years of practice with her father's manipulative household serving her well in this moment. Gerald studied her with narrowed eyes, clearly searching for any sign of deception. See that it remains that way. Whatever your husband believes he might uncover, it would be wise for you to remain uninvolved. Some truths, once revealed, cannot be contained, and the consequences would fall upon everyone connected to this family, including you. The threat, thinly veiled beneath his measured tone, sent a chill through Alina. She had grown up recognizing her father's methods of intimidation, subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation but clear enough to convey his meaning. Whatever secrets lay buried in his dealings with the Whitmore family, Gerald was determined to keep them hidden at any cost. I understand, Alina said quietly, though internally her resolve to uncover the truth only strengthened. After her father departed, Alina found herself unable to focus on her usual tasks, her mind racing through the implications of his visit. If Gerald was concerned enough about Alexander's investigation to make a personal visit and issue thinly veiled threats, then whatever he had done to Alexander's father must have been far more serious than a simple business dispute. She needed to understand the full scope of the situation, both for Alexander's sake and for her own growing need to understand the secrets surrounding her own origins. That evening, she sought out Alexander in his study, finding him once again surrounded by documents, his expression tense with concentration. She had decided, after much deliberation, that honesty was the only path forward, though she chose her words carefully, unwilling to reveal everything she knew until she understood his intentions more fully. My father visited today, she said, watching his reaction closely. Alexander's head snapped up, alarm flashing across his features before he composed himself. What did he want? He seemed concerned about your interest in old family documents, Alina replied. He suggested I should remain uninvolved in whatever you are investigating. Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing, clearly weighing how much to reveal. Alina watched the internal struggle play across his features, and something in his hesitation told her that whatever truth he was protecting weighed heavily on his conscience. There are things about your father's business dealings that concern me, he said finally, choosing his words with obvious care. Financial irregularities that affected my family significantly. What kind of irregularities? Alina pressed, though she already knew the answer from the letters she had read weeks earlier. Alexander hesitated again, and Alina could see him weighing the risks of full honesty against the safety of continued deception. Finally, he set down the papers he had been holding and met her eyes directly. Your father manipulated my father into signing away properties that rightfully belonged to my family. The stress of discovering this betrayal contributed to my father's declining health and eventual death. Alina absorbed this confirmation without visible surprise, though her heart still ached at hearing the words spoken aloud. I am sorry, she said quietly, and she meant it genuinely, despite already knowing the truth. I did not know the full extent of what my father had done. I believe you, Alexander said, and something in his tone suggested this admission cost him something significant, a small crack in the careful walls he had built around his true intentions. Alina studied him for a long moment, weighing whether to reveal her own discovery of the letters, but something held her back. She was not yet ready to confront him about the true purpose behind their marriage, uncertain how such a confrontation might unfold. and increasingly aware that her growing feelings for Alexander complicated her ability to think clearly about the situation. Instead, she offered a different kind of honesty. "If there is anything I can do to help you understand what happened, I want to help. Whatever my father has done, I do not wish to be complicit in hiding it." Alexander studied her with an expression Alina could not quite read, surprise mixed with something that looked almost like guilt. "Why would you help me against your own father?" "Because justice matters more to me than blind loyalty," Alina replied honestly. "And because I have my own reasons for wanting to understand the truth about my family's dealings." She did not elaborate on those reasons, unwilling yet to share the mystery of her own hidden origins, the locket and the paper bearing an unfamiliar name that she had kept hidden for years. But something in her tone must have conveyed the weight of unspoken history, because Alexander's expression softened with curiosity and, she thought, a measure of genuine concern. "What reasons?" he asked gently. Alina hesitated, then made a decision that surprised even herself. She rose from her seat and left the room briefly, returning moments later with the small wooden box she had kept hidden for years. She placed it on the desk between them and opened the lid, revealing the folded paper and the silver locket within. "I found these when I was 12 years old," she explained, watching Alexander's expression as he examined the items carefully. "The paper bears a name that is not mine, Alina Hartley, not Alina Ashford. Whenever I asked my father about my mother's family, about where I came from before joining the Ashford household, he refused to answer, insisting such questions served no purpose." Alexander studied the paper intently, his brow furrowing with concentration. "Hartley," he repeated softly, as though the name stirred some distant memory. He opened the locket carefully, revealing a small portrait inside, faded with age but still recognizable as a young woman with features that bore a striking resemblance to Alina herself. "This is remarkable," Alexander said quietly. "I have heard the name Hartley before, though I cannot immediately place where." Alina felt a flicker of hope at this admission, the first real lead she had encountered in years of quiet searching. "Where did you hear it?" Alexander frowned, trying to recall the context. "I believe it was mentioned in some of my father's older correspondence, though I cannot remember the specific details. There may be more information in the family archives, records that predate even the documents I have already reviewed." The possibility of finding answers, of finally understanding the mystery that had haunted her since childhood, filled Alina with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She had spent so many years wondering about her true origins, half afraid that pursuing the truth too aggressively might bring consequences she was not prepared to face, particularly given her father's clear determination to keep certain secrets buried. "Would you help me search for more information?" she asked, meeting Alexander's eyes directly. Something shifted in his expression, a complicated mixture of emotions that Alina could not fully decipher. "Yes," he said finally, "I will help you find the truth." Over the following days, they began searching through the extensive family archives stored in the estate's lower levels, sifting through decades of correspondence, financial records, and personal documents that had accumulated over generations of Whitmore history. The work was tedious, dusty, and often frustrating, but it brought them closer together in ways neither had anticipated when their marriage began. During one particularly long evening of searching, Alina came across a bundle of letters tied together with faded ribbon, tucked into the back of an old trunk that had clearly not been opened in years. The handwriting on the outer letter matched the elegant script from the paper in her wooden box, and her hands trembled as she carefully untied the ribbon and began reading. The letters told a story that gradually unfolded with each page, revealing a distant connection between the Whitmore and Hartley families dating back nearly 2 decades. Alina's birth mother, it seemed, had been a distant cousin of the Whitmore family, a woman named Charlotte Hartley, who had married into modest circumstances before her untimely death shortly after Alina's birth. But the letters revealed something even more significant. Charlotte Hartley had been the sole heir to a substantial inheritance, one that had been deliberately hidden and protected following a series of threats made against the family by unknown parties seeking to claim the fortune through fraudulent means. Following Charlotte's death, the infant Eleanor had been placed under the guardianship of family friends to protect her from these same threats, her true identity concealed to keep her safe until she came of age. Eleanor read the letters with growing astonishment, piecing together a history far more complicated than she had ever imagined. At some point, it seemed, the family friends entrusted with her care had been unable to continue their guardianship, and through circumstances the letters did not fully explain, she had ended up in the Ashford household instead, her true identity buried and forgotten beneath a new name and a new family history. "This cannot be right," she whispered, reading the passages again to be certain she understood correctly. Alexander, working nearby, noticed her stunned expression and moved closer. "What have you found?" Eleanor handed him the letters wordlessly, watching his expression shift from curiosity to genuine shock as he read through the pages. "This inheritance," he said slowly, looking up at her with an expression she could not quite interpret, "it was never fully claimed. The letters suggest extensive searches were conducted for years to locate the missing heir, searches that apparently continued privately even after most had given up hope of finding her." Eleanor felt the weight of this revelation settling over her, a strange mixture of vindication and confusion. She was not simply an orphan adopted into wealth through Gerald Ashford's charity, as she had always been told. She was the heir to a fortune and legacy entirely separate from the Ashford family, one that had been actively searched for and never found. "Do you know anything about who conducted these searches?" Eleanor asked, her voice unsteady. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing increasingly troubled as pieces of information seemed to connect in his mind. "I believe," he said slowly, "that my own family may have been involved in that search. There were private investigators my father employed for various purposes over the years, individuals whose work was never fully explained to me." The implications of this connection hung heavy in the air between them. If Alexander's family had been searching for the missing Hartley heir, and Eleanor was that heir, then their marriage, born from Alexander's desire for revenge against her father, had somehow led them directly to a truth neither of them could have anticipated. "We need to find these investigators," Eleanor said, urgency creeping into her voice. "We need to understand the full story." Alexander nodded, though his expression remained troubled, weighed down by something he had not yet shared with her. Eleanor noticed his hesitation and studied him carefully, sensing that whatever thoughts occupied his mind extended beyond simple curiosity about her mysterious past. "What is it?" she asked. "What are you not telling me?" Alexander met her eyes, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might finally reveal the truth about his original intentions for their marriage. But instead, he simply said, "I think we should speak with someone who might know more about these investigations. There is a man named Nathaniel Cole, an investigator my father worked with on several occasions. If anyone can help us understand this mystery, it would be him." Eleanor agreed, though she could not shake the feeling that Alexander was still holding something back, some piece of truth he was not yet ready to share. But the pursuit of her own history, the possibility of finally understanding where she truly came from and what fortune might rightfully belong to her, pushed aside her lingering doubts for the moment. They agreed to seek out Nathaniel Cole the following day, both aware that whatever answers they found would likely reshape everything they thought they understood about their marriage, their families, and the tangled web of secrets that had brought them together under such complicated circumstances. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she found herself staring at the silver locket, now resting on her nightstand instead of hidden beneath the floorboard where it had remained concealed for years. The portrait inside, worn with age but still visible, showed a woman with her same eyes, her same quiet strength evident even in the faded image. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt as though she stood on the edge of finally understanding who she truly was, though the path forward remained uncertain, tangled with the complicated feelings she had developed for the husband who had married her for reasons she still did not fully understand, and the father who had spent years hiding truths that now threatened to unravel everything he had built. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with half-formed dreams of faces she could not quite recognize, and a name that felt both foreign and familiar, echoing through her thoughts like a question, finally on the verge of being answered. Nathaniel Cole lived in a narrow house on the quieter edge of the city, a location that suited his profession well, allowing him to conduct his private investigations without drawing unwanted attention. When Alexander and Alina arrived the following afternoon, the man who greeted them at the door bore the weathered look of someone who had spent years uncovering secrets others wished to keep buried. "Duke Whitmore," Nathaniel said, recognition flickering across his features. "I had wondered if I might see you again, given recent developments." "You have heard about my marriage," Alexander said, leading Alina inside. "News travels quickly in certain circles," Nathaniel replied, his gaze shifting curiously to Alina. "Especially news involving families connected to old, unresolved matters." They settled into a small study cluttered with papers and files, and Alina found herself studying Nathaniel carefully, searching for any sign that he recognized her or held information relevant to her mysterious past. His expression remained carefully neutral, professional caution evident in every measured word and gesture. "We came to ask about an investigation you may have conducted years ago," Alexander began, "concerning a missing heir from the Hartley family." Nathaniel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a flicker of surprise quickly masked by his professional composure. "That is a name I have not heard mentioned in a long time," he said carefully. "May I ask why you are interested in this particular matter?" Alina stepped forward, placing the folded paper and the silver locket on the table between them. "Because I believe I may be the person you were searching for." Nathaniel studied the items carefully, his weathered face betraying a mixture of shock and cautious excitement. He examined the locket closely, opening it to study the faded portrait inside, then compared it silently to Alina's features, his eyes moving between the image and her face several times before he finally spoke. "I conducted that search personally," he said slowly, "commissioned by your late father, Duke Whitmore, though he asked me to keep the details strictly confidential, even from most members of his own family." Alexander leaned forward, his expression intense with curiosity. "Why would my father commission a search for a missing Hartley heir?" Nathaniel hesitated, clearly weighing how much information he was permitted to share, even now, years after the original arrangement had been made. Finally, he seemed to decide that circumstances warranted full disclosure. "Charlotte Hartley, the woman in this portrait, was a distant cousin of your family, Duke Whitmore. When she died shortly after giving birth to her daughter, concerns arose about the safety of the infant heir, given the substantial inheritance connected to her lineage and certain individuals who had shown troubling interest in claiming that fortune through illegitimate means." "What individuals?" Alina asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Nathaniel's gaze shifted to her with something like sympathy. "There were several parties interested in the Hartley inheritance following Charlotte's death, individuals who recognized that an infant heir, without proper protection, would be vulnerable to exploitation. Your father, Duke Whitmore's father, took it upon himself to ensure the child was placed under protective guardianship, away from those who might seek to exploit her for financial gain. But something went wrong with that arrangement," Alexander said, connecting the pieces slowly. "The guardianship failed somehow." Nathaniel nodded gravely. "The original guardians, family friends of modest means, found themselves in financial difficulty several years into their care of the child. Desperate for assistance, they turned to a wealthy benefactor who offered to take on the responsibility of raising the girl, promising to protect her identity and eventually restore her true inheritance once she came of age." "Gerald Ashford," Alina said quietly, the pieces finally falling into place with devastating clarity. Nathaniel's expression confirmed her suspicion without requiring words. "Your father, Duke Whitmore's father, continued searching for the child even after this arrangement, concerned that placing her with someone motivated primarily by financial gain rather than genuine care could prove dangerous. Unfortunately, the trail went cold before we could confirm her location or verify her safety. Alina absorbed this information with a mixture of anger and heartbreak, understanding now why her childhood had always felt shadowed by secrets, why her father had grown so cold and evasive whenever she asked questions about her true origins. Gerald had not adopted her out of genuine kindness or family loyalty, as she had always been told. He had taken her in specifically because of the inheritance connected to her name, an inheritance he had likely been working to control or claim for himself ever since. "Does my father know that I am the missing heir?" Alina asked, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I cannot say for certain," Nathaniel replied carefully. "Though given the circumstances of your placement in his household, it seems highly likely that he was aware of your true identity from the beginning, even if he chose to conceal this knowledge from you." The revelation settled heavily over the room, and Alina found herself struggling to process the full weight of what this meant. Her entire life, every interaction with her father, every moment of confusion and unanswered questions about her origins, had been shaped by a deliberate deception designed to protect an inheritance that Gerald had likely been quietly managing or exploiting for his own benefit. "There is something else you should know," Nathaniel added, his expression growing more serious. The Hartley inheritance was substantial, involving properties and investments that would have grown considerably over the years if properly managed. If Gerald Ashford has been controlling access to this fortune under your name without your knowledge or consent, the legal implications could be significant. Alexander, who had remained quiet during much of this exchange, absorbing the implications alongside Alina, finally spoke. What would be required to establish Alina's true identity legally, and to determine what has happened to her inheritance in the years since? Nathaniel considered the question carefully. "Given the documentation you already possess, along with my own records from the original investigation, establishing your identity should be possible through proper legal channels. However, uncovering the details of how your inheritance has been managed or mismanaged would require access to financial records that Gerald Ashford has likely kept carefully hidden." Alina felt a surge of determination replacing her initial shock and hurt. She had spent years wondering about her past, feeling like a stranger within her own family, never quite understanding why her father's affection always felt conditional and distant. Now, finally, she had answers, and with those answers came a fierce resolve to reclaim what rightfully belonged to her. "I want to pursue this," she said firmly, meeting Alexander's eyes. "I want to understand exactly what has happened to my inheritance, and I want to hold my father accountable if he has done something wrong." Alexander studied her with an expression of genuine admiration, though Alina noticed something else beneath the surface, a complicated mixture of guilt and apprehension that she could not quite decipher. She wondered, briefly, whether his reaction stemmed from concern for her well-being, or from something more directly connected to his own original intentions for their marriage. Nathaniel offered to assist with the investigation, promising to gather additional documentation and reach out to contacts who might help verify the details of Alina's inheritance and its current status. They agreed to meet again within the week, once he had made progress on these inquiries. As they departed Nathaniel's residence and climbed back into their carriage, Alina found herself studying Alexander closely, sensing that something in his demeanor had shifted throughout their conversation with the investigator. He seemed distracted, lost in thoughts he was not sharing, and his usual composure appeared strained beneath a weight she could not fully identify. "You seem troubled," she said carefully, breaking the silence that had settled between them during the ride home. Alexander glanced at her, and for a moment, Alina thought he might finally share whatever burden weighed on his conscience. But instead, he offered only a measured response. "This is a great deal of information to process. I imagine you must be feeling overwhelmed." "I am," Alina admitted, "but there is something more troubling you specifically. I can see it." Alexander's expression grew guarded, and he turned his gaze toward the window, watching the city pass by in silence for several long moments before finally speaking. "There are things about the circumstances of our marriage that I have not fully explained to you," he said quietly. "Things I believe I need to share, though I am uncertain how you will receive them." Alina's heart raced at these words, sensing that the moment of full honesty she had been anticipating and dreading had finally arrived. "Tell me," she said simply. Alexander opened his mouth to speak, but before he could continue, the carriage lurched suddenly, throwing them both forward as the driver shouted something urgent from outside. The vehicle came to an abrupt, jarring stop, and Alexander immediately moved to shield Alina instinctively as shouts and commotion erupted around them. "Stay here," he commanded, quickly exiting the carriage to investigate the disturbance. Alina's heart pounded as she waited, straining to hear what was happening outside. After several tense minutes, Alexander returned, his expression grim. "Someone attempted to intercept our carriage," he said quietly. "The driver managed to avoid serious harm, but this was clearly no accident." Fear coiled tightly in Alina's chest as the implications settled over her. If someone had deliberately targeted their carriage so soon after their visit to Nathaniel Cole, it suggested that powerful forces were already aware of their investigation and willing to take dangerous measures to prevent the truth from coming to light. "Do you think my father is behind this?" she asked, though she already feared she knew the answer. Alexander's expression confirmed her suspicion without requiring words. "I believe we need to be far more careful moving forward," he said grimly. "Whatever secrets your father has been protecting, he appears willing to take significant risks to keep them hidden." The revelation about the attempted attack, combined with the earlier confession Alexander had begun but not finished, left Alina with a tangle of fear, determination, and unresolved questions that followed her through the remainder of the journey home. As their carriage finally pulled up to the Whitmore estate, she found herself acutely aware that whatever truth Alexander had been about to share remained suspended between them, waiting for a safer moment that felt increasingly uncertain given the dangers now surrounding their investigation. That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Alina found herself standing at her bedroom window, staring out at the darkened grounds of the estate, turning over everything she had learned that day. She was not simply Alina Ashford, raised in comfort by a father who had shown her conditional kindness throughout her childhood. She was Alina Hartley, heir to a fortune and legacy that had been deliberately hidden from her, placed in danger by unknown forces desperate to prevent her from claiming what rightfully belonged to her. And somewhere within the tangled web of secrets and deception, her own husband held a truth he had not yet found the courage to share. A truth that Alina now suspected might be far more significant and far more painful than she had initially imagined. She pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window, watching her breath fog against the surface, and made a quiet vow to herself. Whatever truths remained hidden, whatever dangers awaited as she pursued her rightful inheritance, she would face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her through years of uncertainty in her father's household. She had spent her entire life feeling like a stranger to her own story. Now, finally, she intended to reclaim it, no matter what the cost. 2 guards now stood watch outside the Whitmore estate each night, a precaution Alexander had insisted upon immediately following the attack on their carriage, and Alina found herself grateful for the added security even as she resented the fear that had prompted it. Days passed in tense anticipation, both of them waiting for news from Nathaniel Cole about the status of her inheritance, and both of them carefully avoiding the unfinished conversation that had been interrupted by the attack. Alina knew Alexander was still holding something back. She saw it in the careful way he chose his words during their evening discussions, in the guilt that occasionally flickered across his features when he thought she was not watching. Whatever truth he had been about to share remained suspended between them, growing heavier with each passing day it went unspoken. It was Constance, Alexander's mother, who finally provided the push Alina needed to demand the full truth. During a quiet afternoon conversation in the older woman's sitting room, Constance studied Alina with unusual intensity before speaking. "You seem troubled, my dear," Constance observed gently. "More troubled than the general uncertainty of recent events would explain." Alina hesitated, uncertain how much to share, but something in Constance's kind, perceptive gaze encouraged honesty. "I believe your son is keeping something from me," she admitted. "Something about the true reasons behind our marriage." Constance's expression grew complicated, a mixture of sadness and resignation that told Alina her suspicions were correct. "My son has carried a great deal of anger since his father's death," Constance said carefully. "Anger that has driven him to make certain decisions I do not entirely agree with, though I understand the pain that motivated them." "What decisions?" Alina pressed gently. Constance studied her for a long moment, clearly weighing whether revealing this information was her place, or whether the truth should come from Alexander himself. Finally, she sighed, her expression softening with what looked like genuine affection for Alina. "I believe you deserve honesty, even if it is not my place to provide it fully. I will only say this. My son did not marry you purely out of a desire for reconciliation between our families. His motivations, at least initially, were far more complicated, and far less noble than that." The confirmation, though not surprising given her own suspicions, still struck Alina with painful force. She thanked Constance for her honesty and excused herself, needing time alone to process this confirmation before confronting Alexander directly. That evening she found him in his study as usual, and this time she did not wait for him to broach the subject carefully. She closed the door behind her and stood firmly, meeting his eyes with an expression that left no room for further evasion. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "The full truth about why you married me." Alexander's expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, resignation, and finally a kind of weary acceptance. He set down the papers he had been reviewing and gestured for her to sit, though Alina remained standing, needing the small measure of control the position afforded her. "I owe you that honesty," he said quietly. "I should have shared this with you long before now." Alina waited, her heart pounding as she braced herself for whatever truth he was about to reveal. "When my father died," Alexander began, his voice heavy with old grief, "I discovered the full extent of your father's betrayal, the forged documents, the stolen properties, the years of trust exploited for personal gain. I was consumed by anger, by a desperate need to see justice served, to reclaim what had been stolen from my family." He paused, meeting her eyes with obvious difficulty. "I devised a plan to marry you specifically because I believed it would give me access to your father's affairs, to information and documents that could help me expose his crimes and reclaim what rightfully belonged to my family. I did not marry you out of any genuine desire for connection or reconciliation. I married you as a means to an end." The words, though not entirely unexpected given her growing suspicions, still struck Alina with a force that left her momentarily unable to respond. She had known, on some level, that Alexander's original intentions had not been purely honorable, but hearing him confirm this so directly, admitting that their entire marriage had been built upon calculated deception, cut deeper than she had anticipated. "So everything between us," she said slowly, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, "the conversations, the time we spent working together, all of it was simply part of your plan." "No," Alexander said quickly, rising from his seat and moving toward her, though he stopped short of reaching for her, clearly uncertain whether such a gesture would be welcome. "Alina, I need you to understand that whatever began as calculation has changed significantly. I did not anticipate coming to care for you the way I have." Alina studied him carefully, searching for any sign of continued deception in his expression, but she found only genuine distress, the guilt of a man who recognized the harm his original plan had caused, regardless of how his feelings might have evolved since then. "How can I trust that what you are telling me now is any more genuine than what you told me during our initial meetings?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "I do not know if I can convince you of that with words alone," Alexander admitted. "I can only tell you that everything has changed since we began this marriage. The plan I originally devised feels increasingly irrelevant compared to what has grown between us, compared to my genuine concern for your safety and happiness." Alina turned away from him, moving toward the window, needing distance to process the tangle of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Anger at his initial deception warred with the undeniable connection she had felt growing between them over the past weeks. She thought of the countless evenings they had spent working together, the moments of genuine laughter and understanding that had passed between them, and wondered how much of that had been real, and how much had simply been Alexander playing a carefully constructed role. "I need time," she said finally, not turning to face him. "Time to understand what any of this means, what I can trust and what I cannot." "Of course," Alexander replied quietly, though Alina could hear the pain in his voice, the fear that this revelation might have irreparably damaged whatever fragile trust had been building between them. She left the study without further words, retreating to her own room where she finally allowed herself to fully process the emotional weight of everything she had learned. She sat by her window for hours, staring out at the darkened grounds, turning over every interaction she had shared with Alexander since their marriage began, searching for signs of the calculation he had admitted to, searching equally for evidence of the genuine connection he claimed had grown between them. The following days passed in careful, cautious distance between them. Alexander gave her space, clearly understanding that pushing for reconciliation too quickly would only deepen her hurt and distrust. Alina, for her part, continued working through her complicated feelings, unable to fully dismiss the connection she had felt with him, but equally unable to simply forget the deception that had shaped their entire marriage. During this period of tension, news arrived from Nathaniel Cole requesting an urgent meeting, information he believed was significant enough to warrant immediate discussion. Despite the strain between them, Alina and Alexander agreed to attend together, both recognizing that whatever personal difficulties existed between them, the investigation into her inheritance and her father's actions required their continued collaboration. Nathaniel greeted them with visible urgency when they arrived at his residence, quickly leading them to his study where documents were spread across his desk in careful organization. "I have made significant progress," he said without preamble, "though what I have discovered is more troubling than I initially anticipated." He explained that his investigation had uncovered evidence suggesting Gerald Ashford had been systematically draining the Hartley inheritance for years, using the fortune to fund various business ventures while representing to outside parties that the wealth belonged entirely to his own family rather than being held in trust for Alina. The scale of the mismanagement and potential theft was substantial, involving properties, investments, and financial holdings that had been quietly transferred or liquidated over the years since Alina had been placed under his guardianship. "This is not simply financial mismanagement," Nathaniel explained gravely. "The documentation suggests deliberate, calculated theft, disguised through complex financial arrangements designed specifically to obscure the true ownership of these assets." Alina absorbed this information with a mixture of anger and heartbreak, understanding now the true scope of her father's betrayal. He had not simply concealed her origins to protect her, as she had once hoped might be the case. He had used her, exploited her hidden inheritance for his own benefit, all while allowing her to believe she owed him gratitude for the modest lifestyle he had provided. "What can be done to address this?" Alexander asked, his protective instincts clearly engaged despite the tension still lingering between himself and Alina. Nathaniel explained that establishing Alina's legal identity as the rightful Hartley heir would be the crucial first step, followed by a formal legal challenge to reclaim the assets that had been improperly managed or stolen. However, he cautioned that such proceedings would likely be lengthy, complicated, and would almost certainly provoke a fierce response from Gerald Ashford, who stood to lose everything if the truth came fully to light. "He has already demonstrated willingness to use dangerous methods to protect his secrets," Alexander pointed out, referencing the attack on their carriage. We should assume he will not simply accept exposure without significant resistance. The gravity of this warning settled heavily over the room, and Alina found herself grappling with the frightening reality of the path ahead. Pursuing her rightful inheritance meant directly confronting her father, exposing years of deception and theft, and likely facing dangerous retaliation from a man who had already shown willingness to endanger their safety to protect his secrets. Despite the fear this prospect inspired, Alina felt her resolve strengthening rather than weakening. She had spent her entire life feeling like a stranger within her own family, never quite understanding the source of the emotional distance that always existed between herself and Gerald. Now she understood the truth, and that understanding fueled a fierce determination to reclaim not just her inheritance, but her true identity and history. "I want to proceed," she said firmly, meeting Nathaniel's eyes with unwavering resolve. "Whatever dangers this path holds, I need to know the full truth, and I need to hold my father accountable for what he has done." Nathaniel nodded, clearly respecting her determination, and outlined the next steps required to formally establish her identity and begin the legal process of reclaiming her inheritance. As they discussed the details, Alina noticed Alexander watching her with an expression of admiration mixed with lingering guilt, clearly torn between pride in her strength and continued awareness of his own role in bringing these dangerous circumstances into her life. As they prepared to depart, Nathaniel offered one final piece of information that struck Alina with unexpected force. "There is something else you should know," he said carefully. "During my original investigation years ago, I discovered that your birth mother, Charlotte Hartley, had a sister, your aunt, who has been searching for you independently for years, unaware of your placement with the Ashford family." Alina felt her breath catch at this revelation. "I have living family." "Beyond what I already knew." Nathaniel nodded. "Her name is Beatrice Hartley. She has maintained a residence not far from the city for many years, continuing to search for any information about her missing niece, despite the trail growing cold long ago. I believe, given recent developments, it would be appropriate to reach out to her directly." The possibility of finally meeting a blood relative, someone connected to the mother she had never known, filled Alina with an overwhelming mixture of hope and apprehension. She agreed immediately to Nathaniel's suggestion, eager to pursue this new connection despite the exhaustion of processing so much significant information within such a short period. As their carriage departed Nathaniel's residence that evening, Alina found herself studying the passing city streets, her mind racing through the implications of everything she had learned. She was on the verge of reclaiming not just her rightful inheritance, but an entire family history that had been hidden from her for her entire life. And despite the tension still lingering between herself and Alexander following his confession, she could not deny that his continued support throughout this journey meant something significant to her, regardless of the complicated circumstances that had originally brought them together. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with the promise of both revelation and danger. But for the first time in years, Alina felt as though she was finally moving toward the truth of who she truly was, rather than remaining trapped within the carefully constructed deceptions that had shaped so much of her life until now. Beatrice Hartley's residence sat at the edge of a quiet village nearly 2 hours from the city, a modest but well-maintained cottage surrounded by carefully tended gardens that spoke of a woman who found comfort in cultivation and patience. When Alina stepped down from the carriage, her hands trembled with a nervous anticipation, unlike anything she had experienced throughout the entire investigation into her origins. The woman who answered the door bore an unmistakable resemblance to the portrait in Alina's locket, older now, with silver threaded through her dark hair and lines of both joy and sorrow etched around her eyes, but the resemblance was undeniable. Beatrice studied Alina for a long moment, her expression shifting from polite curiosity to stunned recognition as she took in the younger woman's features. "You look just like her," Beatrice whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like my sister." The confirmation, spoken with such immediate certainty, broke something loose in Alina's chest. Years of unanswered questions finally finding resolution in this simple, powerful moment of recognition. Beatrice ushered them inside quickly, her hands shaking as she prepared tea with the careful, deliberate movements of someone trying to steady herself through simple tasks. Once settled in her small but comfortable sitting room, Beatrice shared the story of her search for Alina, a search that had spanned nearly 2 decades without success. She explained how she had lost contact with the family friends originally entrusted with Alina's guardianship, how she had spent years following false leads and dead ends, never suspecting that her niece had been placed with a family as prominent as the Ashfords, hidden in plain sight under a name that bore no connection to her true heritage. "I never stopped believing you were alive somewhere," Beatrice said, reaching across to take Alina's hand with a tenderness that brought tears to Alina's eyes. "Your mother would be so proud of the woman you have become." Alina found herself overwhelmed with emotion, finally hearing details about the mother she had never known, learning about Charlotte Hartley's gentle nature, her love of gardening and poetry, the way she had lit up any room she entered despite the hardships she faced during her short life. For the first time, Alina felt a genuine connection to her origins, understanding pieces of her own character and preferences that seemed to echo traits inherited from a mother she had never had the chance to know. Beatrice also shared crucial information about the Hartley inheritance, details that added significant weight to what Nathaniel Cole had already uncovered. The fortune, she explained, had been substantial even before Charlotte's death, and proper management over the intervening years should have grown it considerably, making the scale of Gerald's apparent theft even more significant than initially estimated. "There are documents," Beatrice said, rising to retrieve a small locked box from a cabinet in the corner of the room. "Records your mother left with me before she died, detailing the full extent of the inheritance and the legal protections meant to safeguard it for you until you came of age." The documents Beatrice provided proved invaluable, filling in crucial gaps in the legal case Nathaniel had been building. With this additional evidence, establishing Alina's identity and the true scope of her inheritance became significantly more concrete, providing a solid foundation for the legal challenge they intended to bring against Gerald Ashford. As they prepared to depart Beatrice's cottage that evening, promising to return soon and maintain regular contact moving forward, Alina felt a profound sense of gratitude toward Alexander for his role in bringing her to this moment. Despite the complicated circumstances of their marriage, despite the deception that had originally motivated his actions, his continued support throughout this journey had led her to reclaim not just her rightful inheritance, but a family connection she had never known existed. "Thank you," she said quietly as their carriage began the journey back toward the city, "for helping me find this piece of my history, regardless of how our marriage began." Alexander studied her with an expression of cautious hope, clearly sensing a slight thaw in the tension that had existed between them since his confession. "I am glad I could help, even if my original motivations were far from noble." Alina considered his words carefully, weighing the complicated mixture of emotions she still held toward him. She had not forgiven him fully, not yet, but she found herself increasingly unable to deny that whatever had begun as calculated deception had genuinely evolved into something that felt real, at least from his perspective. Her own feelings remained more complicated, torn between lingering hurt and an undeniable connection that continued to grow despite everything. Their return to the Whitmore estate was interrupted, however, by news that immediately shattered the fragile peace they had found during their visit with Beatrice. Edmund met them at the entrance with visible distress, explaining that Gerald Ashford had arrived unexpectedly during their absence, demanding to speak with Alina about urgent family matters, and had left only after being informed she was not present. "He seemed agitated," Edmund reported, "more so than I have seen him during previous visits. He mentioned something about legal documents and demanded to know where you had gone." Alina exchanged a worried glance with Alexander, both immediately understanding the implication. Somehow, Gerald had learned about their investigation, likely through the same network of informants that had alerted him to Alexander's initial review of old family documents. If he knew about their pursuit of the Hartley inheritance, his desperation to protect his secrets would likely escalate significantly. That night, unable to sleep due to the mounting tension surrounding their situation, Alina found herself wandering the halls of the estate, eventually finding her way to the small library where she had spent many quiet hours since her marriage began. To her surprise, she found Alexander there as well, seated near the fireplace, staring into the flames with an expression of deep contemplation. "Could not sleep either," she asked, settling into a chair near his own. "Too much on my mind," Alexander admitted. "I am concerned about what your father might do now that he suspects we are investigating the truth about your inheritance." Alina nodded, sharing his concern, though something in the quiet intimacy of the moment, the flickering firelight and the late hour, encouraged a different kind of honesty than their previous conversations had allowed. "I have been thinking about everything that has happened between us," she said carefully. "About your original intentions and about what has grown since then." Alexander turned to face her fully, his expression cautious but hopeful. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "I am still hurt," Alina admitted honestly. "Still uncertain how much of our early relationship was genuine versus calculated. But I have also come to believe that people can change, that circumstances can shift someone's heart even when their original intentions were far from admirable." "I never anticipated caring for you the way I have come to," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying genuine vulnerability. "When I devised my original plan, I saw you only as a means to an end, a path toward justice for my family. I did not expect to discover a woman of such genuine strength, intelligence, and kindness. I did not expect to fall in love with the very person I intended to use." The word love, spoken so directly for the first time since their marriage began, hung heavy in the air between them. Alina studied Alexander carefully, searching his expression for any sign of continued calculation, but found only sincere emotion, the vulnerability of a man laying bare feelings he had perhaps not even fully acknowledged to himself until this moment. "I do not know if I am ready to say the same," Alina said honestly, though her voice softened with something that suggested her feelings were moving in a similar direction. "But I no longer believe everything between us has been false. I believe something genuine has grown here, despite how it began." Alexander reached across the small distance between their chairs, taking her hand gently, and Alina allowed the contact, finding comfort in the warmth of his touch despite her continued uncertainty about the full complexity of her feelings. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the fire slowly burn down, both finding a measure of peace despite the dangers and uncertainties that awaited them. This fragile peace was shattered abruptly the following morning when Edmund burst into the breakfast room with alarming news. A messenger had arrived carrying an urgent letter from Beatrice Hartley, delivered with obvious distress and urgency. Alexander broke the seal immediately, his expression growing increasingly grave as he read through the letter's contents. "Gerald Ashford visited Beatrice yesterday evening," he said, his voice tight with concern. "He threatened her directly, demanding she cease any involvement in helping Alina pursue claims about the Hartley inheritance. He suggested there would be serious consequences if she continued providing assistance." Alina felt fear coil tightly in her chest at this news, understanding that her father's desperation was escalating rapidly now that he recognized the full scope of the threat their investigation posed to his interests. "We need to ensure her safety," she said immediately. "We cannot allow him to harm her because of her connection to me." Alexander agreed immediately, arranging for additional protection to be sent to Beatrice's cottage while they considered their next steps. The situation had clearly reached a critical juncture, one that would require decisive action rather than continued careful, methodical investigation. "I believe we need to confront your father directly," Alexander said finally, after much discussion about their options. "Continuing to investigate quietly while he grows increasingly desperate and dangerous seems unwise. We need to present him with the evidence we have gathered and demand accountability, before his desperation leads to further threats or violence." Alina considered this suggestion carefully, understanding the risks involved but recognizing that their current approach, while cautious, had already provoked dangerous responses from her father. Perhaps direct confrontation, backed by the substantial evidence they had gathered, would prove more effective at forcing resolution than continued careful maneuvering. "I want to be present for that confrontation," she said firmly. "This concerns my identity, my inheritance, and my family history. I will not remain passive while others determine my future." Alexander studied her with clear respect for her determination, though concern for her safety remained evident in his expression. "I understand your position, though I worry about the danger such a direct confrontation might pose to you specifically." "I am not afraid," Alina replied, though the slight tremor in her voice suggested otherwise. "I have spent my entire life feeling powerless within my father's household, uncertain of my true identity and unable to challenge his authority. I refuse to remain powerless now that I finally understand the truth." Recognizing the strength of her resolve, Alexander agreed to include her fully in whatever confrontation lay ahead, though he insisted on additional security measures to protect against the possibility of dangerous retaliation. They spent the following days finalizing their legal documentation with Nathaniel Cole's assistance, ensuring every piece of evidence was properly organized and prepared for presentation. As the day of their planned confrontation approached, Alina found herself experiencing a complex mixture of fear, determination, and unexpected clarity about her own identity and worth. Regardless of how her father responded to their confrontation, regardless of the outcome of their legal pursuit of the Hartley inheritance, she understood now, perhaps for the first time in her life, exactly who she truly was, and she refused to allow anyone, including the man who had raised her under false pretenses, to diminish that understanding or the strength she had discovered within herself throughout this difficult journey. The morning of the confrontation arrived with a heavy, gray sky that seemed to mirror the tension gripping the Whitmore estate. Alina dressed carefully, choosing clothing that felt both practical and dignified, a reflection of the woman she had become throughout this journey of discovery. As she prepared to face her father with the full truth finally exposed, she felt Alexander's steady presence beside her, no longer simply a husband bound to her through calculated deception, but a genuine partner standing with her through whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they departed for the confrontation that would determine the future of everything they had worked to uncover, both aware that the outcome of this meeting would reshape not just Alina's understanding of her past, but the entire trajectory of their shared future together. Gerald Ashford's study smelled of aged leather and expensive tobacco, and when Alina stepped inside alongside Alexander and Nathaniel Cole, she found her father seated behind his desk with an expression of practiced calm that did not quite mask the wariness in his eyes. He had clearly anticipated this visit, though whether he understood the full scope of what they had discovered remained uncertain. "To what do I owe this unexpected gathering?" Gerald asked, his voice carrying forced pleasantness that grew increasingly strained as his eyes moved between the three visitors and the thick folder of documents Nathaniel carried under his arm. "We know the truth," Alina said simply, no longer willing to engage in the careful diplomatic dance that had characterized so many previous conversations with her father. "About my true identity, about the Hartley inheritance, about what you have done with the fortune that rightfully belongs to me." Gerald's composed expression flickered for just a moment, a brief crack in his careful mask that confirmed everything Alina had suspected. He recovered quickly, though, his voice hardening into something more defensive. "I do not know what nonsense you have been told, but whatever accusations you intend to make, I assure you they are unfounded." Nathaniel stepped forward, placing the thick folder of documents on the desk between them. "I would suggest reviewing these carefully before continuing to deny the truth, Mr. Ashford. This includes the original guardianship documents, financial records tracing the mismanagement of the Hartley inheritance over the years, and sworn testimony from individuals involved in Alina's original placement under your care." Gerald's eyes moved reluctantly toward the documents, and as he flipped through several pages, his expression grew increasingly pale, the careful mask of confidence crumbling as he recognized the extent of the evidence gathered against him. Finally, he set down the papers, his shoulders sagging slightly as decades of careful deception began to unravel before him. "You do not understand the full circumstances," he said finally, his voice losing much of its earlier bravado. "When the guardians originally caring for you approached me for assistance, I saw an opportunity that seemed reasonable at the time. The inheritance was substantial, and I believed I could manage it responsibly while providing you with a stable, comfortable upbringing. Managing it responsibly does not include depleting the majority of the fortune for your own business ventures, while allowing me to believe I was simply a charity case you had taken in out of kindness," Alina replied, her voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. Gerald's expression grew defensive again, though the confidence had drained from his posture. "I provided you with everything you needed. A home, an education, protection from those who might have sought to exploit an orphaned heiress with no family to guide her." "You provided me with lies," Alina countered sharply. "You allowed me to grow up believing I had no true family, no history, no identity beyond what you constructed for me, while secretly controlling and depleting an inheritance that belonged to me alone." The room fell into tense silence as Gerald absorbed the full weight of Alina's accusation, clearly recognizing that the careful deception he had maintained for nearly 2 decades had finally collapsed entirely. Alexander, who had remained largely quiet throughout this exchange, allowing Alina to lead the confrontation, finally spoke. "There is also the matter of my own father's ruin," he said, his voice carrying the controlled anger he had suppressed for months. "The properties you manipulated him into signing away through fraudulent documents, the betrayal that contributed directly to his declining health and eventual death." Gerald's eyes shifted uncomfortably toward Alexander, and for a moment, something like genuine remorse flickered across his features, though whether it stemmed from actual guilt or simply fear of consequences, Alina could not determine with certainty. "Your father and I had a complicated business relationship," Gerald said carefully. "Decisions were made that, in hindsight, may have caused harm neither of us intended." "Do not insult us with false claims of unintended consequences," Alexander said sharply. "The documentation is clear. You deliberately deceived my father, exploited his trust, and profited significantly from his loss." Recognizing that further denial served no purpose given the overwhelming evidence arrayed against him, Gerald's demeanor shifted into something more calculating, a man assessing his remaining options rather than continuing futile denial. "What is it you intend to do with this information?" he asked finally, his voice carrying a mixture of resignation and lingering defiance. Nathaniel stepped forward to outline their intentions clearly. "We intend to pursue full legal recognition of Alina's identity as the rightful Hartley heir, along with a formal accounting and recovery of the inheritance you have mismanaged over the years. Additionally, given the evidence of fraud connected to the Whitmore family's properties, criminal charges may be warranted depending on further investigation." Gerald's face paled further at the mention of criminal charges, and Alina watched him carefully, searching for any sign of the man who had raised her, however imperfectly, throughout her childhood. She found only calculation and fear, the desperate maneuvering of someone whose carefully constructed empire of deception was finally crumbling around him. "Surely we can reach some arrangement," Gerald said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that Alina had never heard from him before. "I raised you, Alina, whatever my original motivations might have been. Does that count for nothing?" The question struck Alina with unexpected force, forcing her to confront the complicated tangle of emotions she still held toward the man who had shaped so much of her childhood, despite the deception underlying their relationship. She had genuine memories of moments that felt like real affection, mixed among the countless instances of coldness and manipulation that now made painful sense given everything she had learned. "It counts for something," she said finally, her voice softening slightly despite her continued resolve. "But it does not erase the harm you have caused, both to me and to the Whitmore family. I am willing to consider a resolution that avoids criminal prosecution, provided you fully cooperate with returning the assets you have taken and provide complete transparency about your business dealings with the late Duke Whitmore. Gerald considered this offer carefully, clearly weighing the alternative of facing full legal consequences against the more moderate path Eleanor had suggested. After several tense moments of silence, he nodded slowly. "I will cooperate," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of accepting defeat. "Though I hope you understand that whatever mistakes I have made, my affection for you, however complicated, was never entirely false." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, uncertain whether to believe this final claim, but finding herself unwilling to continue the confrontation further. "We will proceed with the legal arrangements through proper channels," she said finally. "I expect full cooperation moving forward." As they prepared to depart Gerald's study, Nathaniel remained behind briefly to discuss the specific legal steps required to formalize their arrangement, while Eleanor and Alexander stepped outside into the cool afternoon air, both visibly drained from the intensity of the confrontation. "You handled that with remarkable strength," Alexander said quietly as they walked toward their waiting carriage. "I do not feel particularly strong," Eleanor admitted, her composure finally cracking slightly now that the confrontation had concluded. "I feel exhausted and confused about how to process everything that has happened." Alexander reached for her hand gently, and this time, Eleanor allowed the contact without hesitation, finding genuine comfort in his steady presence after the emotional turmoil of confronting her father. "You do not need to have everything figured out immediately," he said gently. "What matters is that you finally have the truth, and the power to determine your own future moving forward." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his words even as she continued processing the complicated mixture of relief, grief, and uncertain hope that accompanied this resolution. The following weeks would require careful legal work to formalize her identity and reclaim her inheritance, along with continued negotiations to ensure Gerald fulfilled his promises of cooperation and transparency. But as they climbed into their carriage and began the journey back toward the Whitmore estate, Eleanor found herself reflecting on how far she had come since the day Alexander had first proposed their calculated, deceptive marriage. What had begun as a plan built entirely on manipulation and hidden agendas had transformed into something far more complex, a partnership built on shared struggle, mutual discovery, and a connection that had grown genuine despite its troubled origins. "Thank you," she said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them during the ride, "for helping me find the truth, even though the path to get here was complicated and difficult for both of us." Alexander squeezed her hand gently, his expression carrying both relief and continued hope for whatever future might lie ahead of them. "Thank you for trusting me enough to continue this journey, despite everything that happened between us." As the Whitmore estate came into view ahead of them, its weathered but proud architecture standing as a testament to the family's resilience through years of hardship, Eleanor felt a strange sense of coming home, not just to the physical residence that had become her new life, but to a deeper understanding of her own identity and worth that she had spent years searching for without success. The road ahead remained uncertain, filled with legal complexities and the ongoing work of rebuilding trust between herself and Alexander, along with the delicate task of maintaining some relationship with her father despite everything that had occurred. But for the first time since this complicated journey began, Eleanor felt genuine hope that whatever challenges remained, she would face them with clarity about her true identity and the strength she had discovered within herself throughout this difficult, revelatory chapter of her life. Snow began falling gently over the Whitmore estate on the morning the final legal documents arrived, confirming what Eleanor had spent months fighting to establish. She stood in the study, reading through the official recognition of her identity as Eleanor Hartley, rightful heir to a fortune that had finally been fully accounted for and restored under her control, and felt tears gathering in her eyes despite her best efforts to remain composed. The months since the confrontation with her father had been demanding, filled with legal proceedings, careful negotiations, and the painstaking work of untangling years of mismanaged finances and hidden assets. Gerald had, true to his word, cooperated fully with the process, providing complete transparency about his business dealings and returning what remained of the assets he had controlled under Aliner's name. The relationship between them remained complicated, marked by careful distance rather than genuine reconciliation. But the destructive tension that had defined so much of Aliner's childhood had gradually given way to something more manageable, if not entirely warm. More significantly, the legal proceedings had also uncovered additional evidence confirming the fraudulent manner in which Gerald had acquired the Whitmore properties years earlier, providing Alexander with the documentation necessary to formally reclaim what had been stolen from his family. Combined with the substantial resources now available through Aliner's restored inheritance, the Whitmore estate had begun a remarkable transformation, moving from the edge of financial ruin toward genuine stability and prosperity. Alexander found Aliner in the study that morning, watching her carefully as she finished reading through the final documents. "It is official then," he said quietly, moving to stand beside her. "It is official," Aliner confirmed, setting down the papers and turning to face him with an expression that mixed exhaustion with genuine relief. "After everything, I finally have proof of who I truly am." "You always knew who you were," Alexander said gently, reaching to take her hand. "This simply confirms what your strength and character had already demonstrated throughout this entire journey." Aliner smiled at his words, appreciating the sentiment even as she recognized the genuine truth within it. The months since their confrontation with Gerald had brought them closer together than she had thought possible given the complicated, deceptive origins of their marriage. Alexander had proven himself repeatedly throughout the legal proceedings, standing beside her through every difficult negotiation, offering steady support without ever attempting to control or overshadow her own agency in reclaiming her identity and inheritance. Their relationship had evolved gradually from careful, cautious trust into something that felt increasingly genuine and secure. The initial hurt Aliner had felt upon learning the true motivations behind their marriage had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into something more nuanced, an understanding that people could begin relationships built on flawed foundations and still discover authentic connection through shared experience and mutual growth. "I have been thinking," Alexander said carefully, "about what comes next for us now that the legal matters have finally been resolved." Aliner studied him curiously, sensing something significant in his tone. "What have you been thinking?" Alexander reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, and Aliner felt her breath catch as she recognized the significance of the gesture. "Our original wedding was built on deception and calculation," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring far more meaningful than the formal band she already wore, one clearly chosen with genuine care and consideration for her own preferences rather than social convention. "I would like the opportunity to marry you again, properly this time, with vows built on genuine love rather than hidden agendas." Aliner felt tears gathering in her eyes as she processed the sincerity behind his proposal, recognizing how far they had traveled together since that first tense meeting in her father's modest parlor. "Alexander," she said softly, "are you certain this is what you want? Not out of guilt for how our marriage began, but because you genuinely wish to build a future together." "I have never been more certain of anything," Alexander replied, his voice carrying deep sincerity. "I fell in love with you somewhere along this complicated journey, Aliner. Not the heiress, not the tool I originally intended to use for my own purposes, but you, specifically, your strength, your intelligence, your unwavering commitment to truth and justice, even when the path forward was frightening and uncertain." Aliner felt her own feelings, which she had been cautiously guarding throughout the recent months of legal proceedings and gradual reconciliation, finally crystallize into certainty. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating after months of careful emotional guardedness. "Despite everything, despite how complicated our beginning was, I have come to genuinely love the man who stood beside me through this entire journey of discovery. Their renewed wedding took place several weeks later, a smaller and more intimate affair than their original ceremony, attended by those who had become genuinely important throughout their journey together. Constance, Alexander's mother, stood proudly among the small gathering, her health noticeably improved now that the family's financial troubles had been resolved, and genuine happiness had returned to the estate she called home. Beatrice Hartley attended as well, radiant with joy at witnessing her niece's happiness after so many years of separation and uncertainty. Even Gerald attended, standing at the edge of the gathering with an expression that mixed genuine emotion with lingering awareness of his own complicated role in bringing them to this moment. Elinor had extended the invitation carefully, recognizing that despite everything, he remained connected to her history and identity, even if their relationship would never fully recover the closeness she had once believed existed between them during her childhood. As Elinor walked toward Alexander for the second time, this ceremony carrying none of the cold formality that had characterized their original wedding, she felt genuine joy replacing the cautious uncertainty that had defined so much of her life leading up to this moment. She wore a gown chosen specifically for this occasion, elegant but simple, reflecting the woman she had become throughout this journey of self-discovery and reclaimed identity. Their vows, spoken with genuine emotion rather than practiced formality, reflected everything they had learned about each other and themselves throughout the complicated months since their original marriage. Alexander spoke of his initial anger and desire for revenge, acknowledging openly the harm his original plan might have caused, while expressing genuine gratitude for how their relationship had transformed into something far more meaningful than he could have anticipated. Elinor spoke of her own journey, from a childhood marked by hidden truths and emotional distance, through the painful discovery of her true identity, to finally finding genuine love and partnership with a man who had initially deceived her, but ultimately proven himself worthy of her trust through consistent action and genuine care. Following the ceremony, as their small gathering celebrated with quiet joy in the estate's newly renovated gardens, Alexander drew Elinor aside for a private moment away from their guests. "I have one more thing to share with you," he said, his expression carrying a mixture of excitement and lingering nervousness. He led her toward a section of the estate grounds that had been under careful renovation over recent months, an area Elinor had noticed but not fully investigated given the demands of their legal proceedings. As they approached, she realized the space had been transformed into a beautiful garden, filled with flowers and plants that closely resembled the descriptions Beatrice had shared of Charlotte Hartley's beloved garden from years earlier. "I wanted to create something that honored your mother's memory," Alexander explained, watching Elinor's reaction carefully as she took in the thoughtful gesture. Beatrice provided detailed descriptions of the flowers Charlotte loved most, and I wanted you to have a space here that connects you to the heritage you spent so many years searching for. Elinor felt overwhelmed with emotion at this gesture, understanding the depth of thoughtfulness and genuine care it represented. "This is beautiful," she said softly, moving through the garden paths, recognizing flowers and plants that Beatrice had described during their conversations about Charlotte's life and passions. "Thank you for understanding how important this connection to my mother's memory is to me. I want you to always feel connected to your true history," Alexander said, moving to stand beside her among the flowers. "Not just the painful parts you had to uncover through difficult investigation, but the beautiful parts as well, the parts that celebrate who your mother was and who you have become as her daughter." Standing together in the garden that afternoon, surrounded by flowers that connected Elinor to a heritage she had spent years searching for, and holding the hand of a husband whose journey alongside her had transformed from calculated deception into genuine, devoted love, Elinor felt a profound sense of completion. The path that had brought her to this moment had been marked by pain, betrayal, and difficult revelation, but it had also led her to genuine self-discovery, restored family connections, and a partnership built on authentic understanding rather than social convention or hidden agendas. As evening approached, and their small gathering of guests began preparing to depart. Constance approached Alina with a warm embrace, her expression carrying genuine maternal affection that had grown steadily throughout the months since Alina's arrival at the estate. "I am so proud of the woman you have become," Constance said quietly, "and so grateful that my son found genuine love, even though his path toward it began with such complicated intentions." Alina thanked her sincerely, appreciating the genuine warmth this relationship had developed into. Another unexpected gift from the complicated journey she had traveled since her original, deceptive marriage began. As the last guests departed, and the estate settled into peaceful evening quiet, Alexander and Alina remained in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors that seemed to reflect the emotional richness of everything they had experienced together. "What do you imagine our future holding now?" Alina asked, leaning against Alexander's shoulder as they watched the fading light. "Genuine partnership," Alexander replied thoughtfully. "Continued restoration of both our family's fortunes and reputations, built this time on honesty rather than deception. And hopefully, in time, a family of our own, raised with the truth and love that both of us had to fight so hard to find in our own lives." Alina smiled at this vision of their future, feeling genuine hope replace the uncertainty and fear that had characterized so much of her life before this journey began. She thought of everything she had overcome, the painful discovery of her father's deception, the frightening confrontations and dangerous threats, the gradual, careful process of learning to trust a husband who had initially married her for entirely selfish reasons. Through all of it, she had discovered not just her true identity and rightful inheritance, but genuine strength within herself, the courage to face difficult truths and demand accountability, and ultimately, the capacity to build authentic love even from foundations that had initially been built on calculation and deception. As the stars began appearing in the darkening sky above the Whitmore estate, Alina felt genuinely at peace for the first time in her entire life, secure in her identity, surrounded by family both old and newly discovered, and deeply in love with a man who had proven, through consistent action over difficult months, that his transformation from calculated deceiver to devoted partner was genuine and lasting. Their story, which had begun with revenge and deception, had ultimately transformed into something far more meaningful, a testament to the possibility of genuine growth and authentic connection, even when relationships begin under the most complicated and troubled circumstances imaginable. A gloved hand seized Alina's arm the moment she stepped out of the carriage outside the city courthouse, and before she could cry out, a rough voice hissed close to her ear that she needed to come quietly if she wanted no harm to come to anyone around her. Her heart slammed against her ribs as she registered the presence of two more men closing in near the carriage, their faces partially hidden beneath low hats, their intentions unmistakable in the tense, deliberate way they moved to block every direction of escape. Alexander, only a few steps behind her, reacted instantly, shouting for the driver and lunging forward to place himself between Alina and the man gripping her arm. The commotion drew the attention of passers-by, and within moments, the would-be attackers realized their plan had lost the element of surprise. The man holding Alina released her arm and shoved her roughly aside before turning to flee, his companions scattering into the crowded street before city guards, drawn by the noise, could reach the scene. Alina stumbled but caught herself against Alexander, who immediately wrapped his arms around her, his breathing ragged with fear and adrenaline. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, scanning her for any sign of injury. "I am fine," Alina managed, though her voice trembled and her hands shook uncontrollably. "Frightened but unharmed." City guards questioned witnesses and searched the surrounding streets, but the attackers had vanished into the busy afternoon crowd, leaving behind no clear identification beyond vague descriptions that could match countless men in the city. Alexander insisted on returning home immediately, foregoing the remainder of their planned business at the courthouse, his protective instincts fully engaged as he arranged for additional guards to escort them back to the estate. Once safely inside the Whitmore study, Nathaniel Cole arrived within the hour, summoned urgently to investigate the attempted attack. He listened carefully as Alina and Alexander described the encounter, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he considered the implications. "This does not match the pattern of random criminal opportunism," Nathaniel said grimly. "The coordination, the number of men involved, the clear intention to take Alina rather than simply rob you both, suggests this was carefully planned by someone with specific motivation." "Could my father be behind this?" Alina asked, though something in her instincts suggested a different answer. Gerald, despite everything, had shown no further signs of hostility since their legal resolution, and his cooperation throughout the subsequent months had seemed genuine, if reluctant. Nathaniel considered the question carefully. It seems unlikely, given his current cooperation and the significant legal consequences he would face if connected to any further criminal activity against you. "I believe we should consider other possibilities. Individuals who may have been financially harmed by the exposure of Gerald's fraudulent business dealings." This theory gained credibility over the following days as Nathaniel's investigation uncovered a name previously unknown to Alina and Alexander. A merchant named Frederick Colby had been one of Gerald's business partners in several ventures funded through the misappropriated Hartley inheritance, ventures that had collapsed entirely once the legal proceedings exposed the fraudulent foundation of the money involved. Colby had lost a substantial personal fortune in the resulting collapse, and according to Nathaniel's sources, he had been making increasingly desperate and threatening statements about reclaiming his losses by any means necessary. "He believes you owe him compensation for the losses he suffered," Nathaniel explained, "even though the fault lies entirely with your father's fraudulent management of funds that were never legitimately his to invest in the first place." The revelation left Alina with a complicated mixture of fear and frustration. Understanding that the consequences of her father's years of deception continued to ripple outward in ways neither she nor Alexander could have fully anticipated. "What can be done to address this threat?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear still lingering from the attempted attack. Alexander, his protective instincts fully engaged, immediately began arranging for increased security measures throughout the estate and for any future outings Alina needed to undertake. "We will not allow this man to threaten your safety," he said firmly. "Whatever losses he suffered, they resulted from his own choice to participate in fraudulent schemes, not from any wrongdoing on your part." Nathaniel agreed to continue investigating Colby's activities and whereabouts, working alongside city authorities to build a case that could lead to his arrest before he attempted any further dangerous action. Over the following 2 weeks, tension gripped the Whitmore estate as they awaited news of the investigation's progress, every unexpected sound or unfamiliar visitor triggering heightened alertness among the household. The breakthrough came unexpectedly one evening when a member of the estate's household staff reported noticing an unfamiliar man observing the property from a distance near the edge of the grounds. Alexander immediately organized a search, and within an hour, guards had apprehended a man matching Colby's description, attempting to scale the estate's perimeter wall under cover of darkness. The man, when questioned, initially refused to cooperate, but faced with clear evidence of his trespassing and the earlier attempted attack, he eventually confessed to organizing the assault outside the courthouse, motivated by desperate financial ruin and a misguided belief that forcing Alina to compensate him for his losses represented his only remaining option for recovering his fortune. City authorities took Colby into custody, and the subsequent investigation confirmed his connection to the men who had attempted to seize Alina outside the courthouse. With Colby's arrest and the thorough documentation Nathaniel had compiled throughout the investigation, the immediate threat to Alina's safety finally came to an end, allowing the household to gradually return to a sense of normalcy after weeks of heightened tension and fear. In the aftermath of this frightening episode, Alina found herself reflecting deeply on the ongoing consequences of her father's years of deception, understanding that rebuilding trust and safety after such extensive betrayal would require continued vigilance and patience. Yet she also found herself grateful for the strength of the partnership she had built with Alexander throughout these difficult months. His unwavering protection and support, providing a foundation of security that helped her navigate even this frightening new threat with resilience rather than despair. Months passed following Colby's arrest, and gradually, genuine peace settled over the Whitmore estate. The legal proceedings surrounding Aliner's inheritance concluded fully, with all disputed assets properly accounted for and returned to her control. The restored fortune, combined with careful management under Aliner's direct oversight, brought genuine prosperity back to the Whitmore family, allowing for continued restoration of the estate and the gradual rebuilding of the family's reputation and standing within society. Alexander's relationship with Gerald remained distant but civil, both men recognizing that maintaining some connection served Aliner's well-being even if genuine warmth between them would likely never fully develop. Gerald, for his part, seemed genuinely changed by the consequences of his exposed deception, adopting a more modest lifestyle, and occasionally reaching out to Aliner with gestures that suggested authentic remorse for the years of manipulation that had shaped her childhood. Beatrice became an increasingly important presence in Aliner's life, visiting the Whitmore estate regularly and sharing countless stories about Charlotte Hartley that helped Aliner build a rich, meaningful connection to the mother she had never known. These visits brought Aliner genuine joy, filling in the missing pieces of her history with warmth and love rather than the painful secrecy that had defined so much of her earlier life. As winter gave way to spring nearly a year after their renewed wedding ceremony, Aliner discovered she was expecting their first child, news that filled both herself and Alexander with overwhelming joy and anticipation for the future they were building together. The pregnancy brought a new sense of purpose and hope to the estate, everyone eagerly anticipating the arrival of a new generation that would inherit not just the restored Whitmore fortune, but the genuine love and hard-won wisdom both parents had gained throughout their complicated journey together. Constance, whose health had continued improving steadily since the resolution of the family's financial troubles, found particular joy in preparing for her first grandchild, spending countless hours with Aliner discussing family traditions and sharing stories about Alexander's own childhood that brought new dimensions to Aliner's understanding of the man she had married. Aliner often found herself reflecting, during these peaceful months of anticipation, on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point in her life. She thought of the frightened, guarded young woman who had agreed to marry a stranger out of fear of her father's authority, unaware that this seemingly cold, calculated arrangement would eventually lead her to genuine love, restored family connections, and a deep, authentic understanding of her own identity and worth. The child, when finally born on a bright autumn morning nearly a year and a half after Aliner's initial marriage to Alexander, arrived healthy and strong, immediately becoming the center of joy and celebration throughout the Whitmore estate. They named her Charlotte, honoring the grandmother she would never have the chance to meet, but whose memory and legacy would continue living on through the family Aliner had worked so hard to reclaim and rebuild. Holding their daughter for the first time, surrounded by family both old and newly discovered, Aliner felt the full weight and beauty of everything her difficult journey had ultimately brought her. The revenge that had originally motivated Alexander's deceptive proposal had transformed, through months of shared struggle and genuine growth, into a partnership built on authentic love, mutual respect, and unwavering support through even the most frightening and dangerous circumstances. As Alexander joined her, gently touching their daughter's small hand with an expression of overwhelming love and pride, Aliner felt genuinely, completely at peace with everything that had brought her to this moment. The path had been marked by deception, danger, and painful revelation, but it had ultimately led her exactly where she needed to be, surrounded by genuine love, secure in her true identity, and building a future filled with the honesty and authentic connection that had been so painfully absent from the early years of her complicated, remarkable life. Their story, which had begun with a duke's calculated plan for revenge, had transformed completely into a testament to genuine love's power to grow even from the most troubled beginnings, proving that authentic connection, once discovered, could overcome even the deepest betrayals and lead to a future filled with lasting happiness, restored family bonds, and the unshakable security of finally knowing exactly who you are and where you truly belong.